Conflict between people is a disagreement or clash of ideas. We all know what that's like. It's annoying, irritating and frustrating, but you quickly get over it. Conflict between countries is much more serious and has much longer-lasting repercussions. In this programme, we will look at the impact of conflict, Part 1 and 2, aid, a help or a hindrance, the economics of conflict, and Afghanistan, a case study of conflict. What happens to a country as a result of war? What are the consequences of conflict? There are some recognised ways to measure the effects of conflict. Some tally the number of people dead or missing. An estimated 450,000 have died in Darfur, Sudan, since the start of their civil war in 2003. But death directly through conflict is often the tip of the iceberg. It doesn't account for subsequent deaths through malnutrition and disease, which can significantly affect the numbers. Others measure the effects of war by the building infrastructure that has been destroyed. Some people measure conflict in cash terms. They count the money spent on weapons and defence. Some look at the environmental destruction that conflict causes. But the real impact of war in any society is not so easily measured. It's about the things that are unable to develop whilst a country's in conflict. Health and education are frequently neglected during conflict. Money is spent on military schemes instead of agriculture or schooling. Food and water shortages are common during and after conflict. Post-war recovery is always made more difficult if a population is underfed and illiterate. Only a few years ago, Zimbabwe was the breadbasket of Africa. It produced enough food for its own people and a surplus for export.
My father grew maize, sunflower, sorghum, groundnuts, and ran 800 to 1,000 head of beef cattle. Growing up there probably was quite idyllic.
As a result of years of poor governance and violent fighting over land ownership, farming has been severely neglected. Now, an estimated 45% of Zimbabwe's people are considered malnourished. In just those few years, the life expectancy of Zimbabweans has dropped from 60 years to 45, amongst the lowest in the world.
Zimbabwe in the first 20 years was an exciting place to be, whether you were white or black. There was a lot of development, a lot of enthusiasm. There were the downsides of it, but it was a very good country in which to live and work, and I wish I was still there, but politics is such that it's not possible to continue there.
Although Zimbabwe is in desperate need of investment and aid, governments are reluctant to assist a country whose leader is deemed to have breached many human rights and failed to provide the basics for a country. Fortunately, non-governmental organisations are still willing to help, including Médecins Sans Frontières and Comic Relief. After conflict, it's hard enough to rebuild schools or universities that may have been damaged, but it's harder to replace the lost years of learning. 65% of children in conflict areas miss out on school, and teachers often move to other countries where the conditions and pay are better. In Zimbabwe, schools are so underfunded that the children are asked to bring furniture from home. Literacy rates are plummeting in a country once renowned for its education system. An exodus of teachers and other professionals contributes to a brain drain. Often, academics and critics of a violent regime are persecuted. If they flee, the country loses many thinkers with skill to plan a post-conflict recovery. There are worse things for a child than having to take their own equipment or not going to school at all. One of the most disturbing aspects of war is that of child soldiers. Although it is illegal to use children under 15 for military combat, many countries still do. During the Sierra Leone Civil War, children as young as 7 were recruited as cheap labour. Some were used for chores, spying and for sex, but many were armed and sent into combat. Children are often recruited initially as if they're part of a game. Later, Their families are threatened to keep them in the army. Some displaced children sign up to join the army because they feel it's their only option. Child soldiers are considered brave fighters as they do not fully understand the dangers of battle. They have been responsible for some of the most vicious attacks on their perceived enemies. Although child soldiers can commit terrible crimes, the International Court views them as victims themselves. Other human costs of war are almost impossible to calculate, but are every bit as significant. Wars increase the incidence of mental illness in a community, particularly depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Being exposed to injustice and atrocities makes it very difficult to adapt to normal life at the end of a war.
When people arrive at a camp, they're generally not in a very good state, both physically and mentally. They have left their homes for a reason. They're often very afraid. They're often traumatized, and they've often had the tragic experience of having to leave people either in their homes or on the way, people like the elderly who can't make the journey because generally people travel quite a long way. So the priority when they arrive is to meet their immediate needs. So you have to look for those who need medical care immediately and make sure that they've got that medical care.
Mental illness most often affects the most vulnerable in the community. Women and children are most at risk. Research shows that many children who've grown up knowing only conflict have little desire to live. The World Health Organization urges supportive programs to repair the psychological damage of war. The effects of conflict are extremely complex. We've all seen images of refugees in the media. They are so common, it's possible we've even become a little desensitised. But every refugee has the same needs as any of you watching this. They need food, shelter, and safety from persecution. Refugees are literally people seeking refuge in another country. They might seek refuge from natural disaster, danger, hunger, or persecution. Many are women and children. They're often forced to flee from danger and violence because of their religion or ethnicity. Internally displaced persons, or IDPs, are also fleeing trouble zones, but they remain within the borders of their own countries. The good news is that refugees and IDPs have rights according to international law and are to be protected. They have the right to humanitarian assistance, the right to protection from abuse, and the right to seek asylum. The bad news is that the scale of the refugee problem today is vast and growing bigger. The United Nations estimates that there's around 20 million refugees in the world. Although many governments and charities are willing to offer aid, it can still be difficult to get enough aid to the right places fast enough.
The ease of accessing people when they have grouped into a camp-like situation, it obviously completely depends where they are. So in a situation like Darfur, where people have been displaced because of conflict, it has been possible to get to those people who are closer to the urban centres. However, there have been restrictions placed on organisations like MSF accessing people by the government.
One of the main problems is that the majority of refugees are mainly in less economically developed countries, the ones who can least afford them. Around 200,000 Sudanese refugees have crossed from Darfur into camps in neighbouring Chad, a country which does not have the resources to support them and which itself relies on international aid support.
It could be that they're fleeing fighting or persecution, and they arrive at generally an urban centre, somewhere that they think is going to give them more opportunity, and they literally set up camp. You provide them with food and water first of all. They generally get registered if it's an organised refugee process, and then their next set of needs are met. So they're provided with shelter, blankets, pots and pans, a stove perhaps, scissors, basic things that we kind of would all need if it was about our survival, basically.
Refugee camps are set up as temporary homes where people live in tents and have very basic needs met. They are designed as short-term relief, but people often get stuck there for years, unable to work or to safely return to their country of origin. Refugees can become dependent on aid. This continues a cycle of poverty that is hard to break. But in some ways, these are the lucky ones. Not all refugees will find camps to live in. Some will take immense risks to travel overseas and seek asylum in different countries. They often sail in overcrowded boats. They risk human trafficking, pirate attack, theft, murder, and drowning in the hope of finding a safer place in another land. These refugees are known as boat people. Not all countries welcome asylum seekers with open arms. In South Africa, as many as 17,000 people per month are trying to cross the border to escape violence and hunger in Zimbabwe. This has angered many South Africans who believe their country cannot sustain the influx of newcomers. South Africa does not recognise the Zimbabweans as refugees, and many are turned back at the border. But Zimbabweans, desperate to flee the violence of their home country, often try again. Some risk swimming across crocodile-infested waters. Ironically, the countries that can most afford it accommodate the least amount of refugees. 72% of global refugees are hosted by developing nations. Settling refugees and asylum seekers into new countries, whether developed or not, offers challenges. Many are grieving. Many suffer from a sense of displacement in unfamiliar surroundings. Fortunately, the international community is learning more about how to deal with refugees and safely integrate them into communities. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees works to improve the legal and practical status of refugees. And June 20th is designated World Refugee Day to celebrate the courage and determination of people forced to flee their countries. Refugees have a legal right to protection. Most refugees move to countries that can least afford them. Countries affected by conflict often need extra help to keep the population safe and fed. This help is known as aid and is given by international governments and charities. Many of the names will be familiar to you: Red Cross, UNICEF, Médecins Sans Frontières, Oxfam, etc. Some non-governmental organisations or NGOs access funds through lobbying governments. Some, like SportAid, fundraise via public participation and sponsorship. All of them accept public donations. There are different types of aid. It's usually divided into short-term or long-term.
The difference between short-term and long-term aid is that short-term assistance is only ever intended to get people through a crisis, to get them through a crisis alive and hopefully with some sort of dignity intact, with the hope that long-term assistance will enable them to start rebuilding their lives. So yeah, the short-term assistance, I mean, it's been called a sticking plaster, and really that's all it is. We just want to try and get people through whatever crisis it is that is blighting their lives at the moment. Examples of short-term assistance are obviously healthcare, and that means the GP services, special support for pregnant and lactating women, for children, for other vulnerable groups, but also because a lot of our work is in Africa and is in tropical parts of the world, so dealing with tropical diseases like malaria. We also, of course, do take on more kind of chronic long-term diseases such as HIV, AIDS and TB. And sometimes we are providing short-term assistance for a very long time, actually. These situations don't change. Coming on to the longer-term development approaches, those are helping people to rebuild their lives and to stand on their own 2 feet. You then come to implementing projects like microcredit, where you lend people money to start up a business. So you could have handicrafts to sell to shops in the West. Quite a lot of development organisations are doing climate change mitigation work, helping farmers grow drought-resistant crops. So it's all about trying to give people an income and trying to lift them out of poverty.
Long-term aid is often tied aid. It's when a donor country gives aid money to a recipient country but demands that the money be spent buying goods in the donor country. It's supposed to benefit both countries, and it's more like a loan than a gift, as the money ends up back with the donor. However, the UN criticises Tide aid due to lack of price competition. The US donates money to African nations for HIV and AIDS drugs, but insists the money be spent in the US. Cheaper generic drugs can be purchased from Brazil or India for $350 per annum, compared to the same branded drugs from the US, costing $15,000. Aid delivered by charities or NGOs has been administered to countries regardless of politics. Charities such as Médecins Sans Frontières deliberately avoid political affiliations and focus on dealing with humanitarian needs. But that changed recently after the International Criminal Court issued a warrant for Omar al-Bashir, President of Sudan, for breaches of human rights. Within days of the warrant, al-Bashir, in retaliation, expelled 13 NGOs who were helping to deliver aid to the huge number of IDPs in refugee camps.
With regard to the refugees in Darfur that we had to leave behind, we don't know a great deal about their situation now. Of course, we are very worried about them. The health situation in Darfur was reasonably stable when we left, through a lot of effort from aid workers. And so without that, we're very worried that the health situation will go downhill rapidly. There are some organisations like MSF left in Darfur. However, the majority of assistance had to leave. So what we understand from the UN, from the United Nations, who are still there, is that at the moment the situation is fairly stable. However, we think it is fragile, and that situation is likely to change. Humanitarian aid should be allowed to be independent. That's the point of it. It is apart from politics, and there are no political factors taken into account in the decision-making. The priority is about getting assistance to the people who need it. Unfortunately, these are highly politicised and very tense environments. There is a lot at stake for the different political actors involved. Say, again, a situation like Darfur, where you have a government fighting a rebel or several rebel groups, and political actors feel that it is in their interest sometimes to make it difficult for us to reach the people that we need to. That tends to be demonstrated in two different ways. Firstly, we simply get obstructed, so it's made impossible for us to reach the people that we want to through bureaucracy, through simply not receiving the permission from the authorities to travel to a particular area. And the other way, of course, that aid